The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's Justin again from Toronto, Canada. We're just about to get started here. Today, we're going to be talking about gamification with using Widget Designer and Pandoras Box, and using a lot of the methods that we've been talking about so far on our webinars to date. So we're going to start with a bit of a review, and then we'll start with building a pretty simple game. So to start, we need to, obviously first plan our game, which game we want to build. In this case today, we will be building a memory game, a matching game, where we flip cards and match them. So we need to figure out first the game logic. We'll go over that in a few slides. And what we'll be using today, we'll be using some if statements, we'll be using switch statements, and we'll be using loop statements. And what we're going to do actually today as well is we're likely going to be doing a lot more of these webinars coming up. So let's actually build this widget to kind of have a base so we can continue to add games to this Widget Designer and Pandoras Box project as well in the future. So a lot of this will be a lot of data management also. So let's figure out how we can use what we've learned so far to actually do some things that aren't just examples of showing how to bring up some text on our screen, where we can have an audience member or someone interacting with it. So just again, a quick review. We've got an if statement. So we have our input, if condition. So if it's true or false, let's say if x equals 1, it's true. Do an action. If it's false, do another action. And of course, as we mentioned before, we can nest if statements inside of each other. We have switches where we can do multiple conditions, and it's self-terminating. So as soon as condition 1 is true, it activates number 1 and doesn't try and activate any of the other ones. So it can make things a bit faster. We've also got loops. So we start with our loop. We declare the number of times we want to loop in the widget. We do the code inside of the loop. We increase the counter. We see if we've counted enough. If we have, we finish. If we don't, we continue with the loop. We do it over and over again. And now we're going to talk about our gamification logic. So again, we're going to be building more than one game in this widget. Today, we're going to be building the memory game only, but knowing that we're going to be adding more games to this widget, we can prepare for that now so we don't have to go back and redo or refactor our code for next time. So what we'll be working with is our Pandoras Box layer interaction. So to get Widget Designer and Pandoras Box working together, one of the easier ways to make this happen is to actually use the layers themselves as buttons inside of Widget Designer, and we'll be going over that very first. And then we'll be looking into widget game interaction. So we're going to have to tell Pandoras Box and Widget Designer which game we're playing, so we know which macros to execute and which scripts to execute. We'll be accepting the layers in Pandoras Box as buttons, but Widget Designer will also be controlling Pandoras Box, its layers and sequences to start games, to to flip cards over and things like that. So our memory game logic. To play the game, I think we all know how to play a memory game. So we have to flip a card over. So we will touch the card and we'll flip it over. And what we'll have to test is this card already flipped? If it's not, then we'll flip the card over. So if it's the first card that's flipped, we have to record that one card is flipped. We have to record what card is flipped. So this is part of the matching logic, because of course we have pairs on the screen. Once that's done, the second card is going to be flipped. Again, is the card already flipped? We have to record this, the second card is flipped. We again record that card that's flipped, and then we compare the two cards together. Do they match? Yes. Okay, so we give a point to the player, and we keep the cards flipped over. If it's false, then we flip both cards back over so the game can continue. And then once all the cards have been matched, do we have a winning action? And of course, you know, this is the prize. We don't give out money or anything like that. So we just do a nice animation. So to actually set this up in the game itself, we need to be able to reset the game and set it up. And of course, I think we want to randomize the card placement as well. So we're not going to we will programmatically place the cards, but we will do so at random. There are randomizers built into the widget designer, and we'll be leveraging those to be able to set up our game. We have to flip all the cards back to 0, whether or not the game is in progress. We want to be able to reset it to 0, and after the game has been won, we want to also reset it to 0 and randomize the cards again. And we also, when we do that, we need to send the layers to Pandora's box. We need to send the new information, the new cards to Pandora's box. The most important, one of the most important parts in this is data management. So we could have this built with dozens and dozens of variables inside of Widget Designer to store which card is flipped, card 1, card 2, card 3, and so on. And again, the matches, the pairs. But in this case, we will be using one single JSON object for this. And this is basically what it's going to look like. So we have our game mode. This is what we're talking about earlier, where we're going to have multiple games built into this one widget designer. So we'll start off with memory as the game mode, and then we also have our game data. Yeah, so we also have our game data. So we have our, this isn't indented correctly, my apologies. Again, it'll still work. JSON doesn't care whether or not it's indented. This is just for us to read. So we'll be storing things like score, whether or not the card, how many cards have been flipped, and if this card is flipped. So in this case, we will be using a project that I have built here. We won't go over how to build this in Pandora's box, simply because this is more of a widget designer webinar. And I think we all can figure out with pretty basic understanding of widget designer, or sorry, Pandora's box, how to set up 3 rows and 5 columns of cards. So I'm using an object to make these planes so they can have front and back. So if I grab, let's say, card 2 here, and we flip card 2 over, we can see that it has a back on it. And we've also got a folder full of memory tiles. So tile 1 is here, and I can double click on that, and there's tile 1. We'll put tile 2 onto layer 2, and we'll flip this one over as well. And we can see there, those are the cards that we're going to be matching. So the reason we have the object is so we can have a front and a back to these cards. And what we'll be doing as well, so as we said before, we'll be using the layer interaction within Pandora's box, which gives us a lot of flexibility in the sense that we can use in the manager, we can use what's called picking mode to act as if we're using the cursor inside of Pandora's box. And in the manual and maybe other webinars, we can also look into how we can send a mouse cursor to either to a client or receive that cursor information from the client as well. So if we were to plug in a client, so a Pandora's box client, into a touchscreen, we can plug that touchscreen USB cable into the player and then interact with the actual touchscreen itself. So when you do interact with the touchscreen and touch a layer, that information gets fed back into Pandora's box and Widget Designer here. So we can see we have a mostly blank project here. And before we get started, are there any questions about this stuff?
No, this is all clear. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay. So we're going to create a node. So we do need the paid version of Widget Designer to be making this kind of widget. So we're going to go into Nodes, Inputs, Pandora's Box, and Layer Interaction. I'm going to place that onto the interface here, and we'll double click on this this node. Now here we would be putting in the IP address of our client machine. In this case, I'm going to be using our manager. I'll be using my IP address I have here at home, and if I click apply, you can see now when I mouse over these layers, we get actually a lot of information. So I can see what layer. So we see device 1, device 6, device 2, and so on. And also, when we click, you can see left button is activated. So those are some of the actions we'll be using today. We also, so we can see here, we also do see the X and Y coordinate on our output. So we can see 19, well, it's scaled right now, so the X and Y coordinate on our output, and the U and V coordinates on our UV. So that does come in handy for other projects in the future. Just good knowing that it's there. So from here, we need to take these values into Widget Designer from Pandora's Box, so we can act on them when they change. So the first thing we need to do is to capture our device ID that we'll be using, so we can interact with that. So when the person clicks on tile 1, we know that that's layer 1 that they're clicking, and we can use that for our logic. So if we go into variables, we'll create a variable called selected layer. I've already done this, and I will create a node. So we can click on the output of that node, click output, generic, and variable. I'll double click on variable and click on selected layer. And I want it to be the device. Now we can open variables again, and we can look at selected layer here, and we can see that this changes when I mouse over one of these layers. That's great. Next, we want something to happen when we click on one of these layers. So next, we will create a output node, a generic script output node. So if mouse left equals 1, and just for now, we will do a debug message. And we can say, we'll open up the debugger. And we can see it's clicked. Now we can actually bring a variable into this device, or sorry, into this debugging window, and we can say selected layer. So now when we click, we can see selected layer 6 has been clicked, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So now we have the logic to be able to actually flip over these cards. So that's a good start. But of course, we're going to need to go a little bit farther than that. So to start, we will be creating some macros. First, we want to be able to tell the widget which game we're going to be playing. So select game. So we have we also have in here a JSON variable that will have all of our values for our game data. So if we go into, so we created that variable. So if we right-click on variables, we can create a JSON variable. All right, so that automatically is the JSON data type already, so we don't have to declare it as a JSON, and we can directly edit this JSON file. So if I say game JSON, we can see it pop up already here as a selectable member and the selectable variable. And from its members, we can say set. And now we can tell it we want to set game mode at its location with a comma and then memory. So now when we activate this this macro, it will activate sorry, it'll change this the data in this JSON file, in this JSON variable. So we can create a button to do that. So, and we can make this a little bit more dynamic than this as well. So we can use our parameters inside of our macro as well. So we can say game, and then we can actually just change this to game. So if we go to our button and we say select game, we can see that's our macro, and then I'll add the parameter here and type in memory. And once we click on this button, I'll label this button as well. Start memory game, apply. Now when we click on this button, it will activate this macro and assign the data memory to the object game mode inside of the JSON variable. Now we need to start initializing some more of our data that we're going to need to store inside of our JSON variable. So what I'm going to do here, just so this is a little bit more visible, I'm going to create a text box and increase the text size to put 24, so we can all follow along and see what this is saying. So we're not looking just in our variable window, because this is obviously very small. So what I'll do here is initialize JSON is what I'm typing here. And at the bottom of this, I'm going at this macro, I'm going to just put in text box 1 clear. So we'll clear the text box, and then text box 1 dot text equals game JSON to pretty string. So if we test this, now we can see what our variable is right in this text box here. So the data that we need to store inside of our game memory will be quite a few things. So we need to store, we need to be able to store, let's say, the score. So we're going to create, because we're going to be creating a JSON object inside of an object. We're nesting them in here. We need to create a local variable, a local JSON. And to do that, we can just do this, again, as we learned yesterday from Janita's wonderful webinar. And now we can say local JSON set, and we can say score. And we'll put comma 0. That's fine, that one's going to be an integer. And we can see our progress by executing this, do pretty string, and we'll test this. And we can see this is our score. We'll also need to put in another, I'm going to just we need this to be another object. So we're going to have a few objects inside of some objects here. So what we'll have is this. I have these in the wrong order. So we'll actually be showing like this. Nope. We already have that one. So we can't have a local variable and a global variable with the same name. I hope that makes sense. You can't have more than one thing with the same name at the same time. So we can see our game data here, which is going to be score and so on. So now we have to go, we're going to also set our flipped. We need to know how many of our cards have been flipped over, as we said in our game logic. So we need to know how many cards have been flipped over. So if there's 0 cards flipped over, we'll flip 1 over. If there's 2 cards flipped over, that's when we start our comparison. And if there's 2 cards flipped over, we don't want to allow any more cards to be flipped. Being 4 times in a row, it won't flip any more but 2 cards over, which is why we want this this member in here. So we also want that to be 0. And we would like also, we need to know our state, our flips, so we can test if a card is already flipped over, we don't want it to flip over again. So the quickest way we're going to do this today is just to create 15 zeros. Should be that when I'm talking. And we want card ID, or card IDs. And this will be our state of which cards are matches and which ones are not. So if we test this again, oh, I didn't put close brackets on the end here. So here we can see what this is our game data. We need this to be memory actually. Okay. And we have our score, our flip status, how many are flipped. We need the IDs of the ones that are flipped already. And the nice thing about JSON files and arrays like this is we don't actually really care what order they show up in this list, because we can actually because we can call things by the members, by the object names. We're not going to be searching for anything. We directly ask for game data score or game data flipped automatically. So we want the IDs of the flipped cards. Flipped IDs, let's call it. And this is going to be 2 because we're making 2 matches. Okay. Now we can initialize this again. So we can see that we have our game data. We need to put this inside of another member. Okay. And now we can say the game JSON. So this will be the master, this master JSON file, the global one, game JSON.set, and we'll say game data, sorry, and this one needs to change to memory. My apologies. game data, and we will assign local game JSON. I know this is a little bit convoluted, but what we'll see at the end of this is, so we have our game mode, our game data, the game is called memory, and then this is all of the data we have inside of the memory game. So when we are assigning or recalling any data from here, this is where we will be assigning it to and calling it from. Not the text box itself, but this is the, as we said, if we go into variables now, we can see that this is the global JSON variable now. Is everyone following along? Do we have any questions for this? I know this is a little fast and advanced, but questions are welcome.
Yes, I do have a question, which is, could you explain again why exactly I need that local JSON variable twice?
Yes. So when we're declaring a JSON locally or globally, if we're going to be putting an object inside of an object for a JSON, we need to use a JSON object to put inside of a JSON object. So instead of, we also could very well take our, we can manually type everything. So I can say variable JSON equals, and then we can, in a single quote, I can type in now double quote, object one quotation colon, and then we can put 1, 2, 3 as our value, and then list one, and now we would put a 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and so on. And now we've closed that, and then to JSON. Sorry, we need a close quotation, and now we can debug this JSON, debug message JSON to pretty string. And I'm going to comment if this one. And we'll test that, and we can see this didn't work. Get rid of this pretty string. Oh, because I have a comma on here and not a colon. See, this is why doing this in a pretty string. So I just made that error there on purpose, of course, to kind of demonstrate how kind of fallible this doing it in this method is. If you do have a typo, if you put a comma instead of a colon and so on, then it's not a valid JSON file. It's not going to crash anything. It's not going to make anything fail, but there is more room for error. So if we use this method here, then the widget designer will automatically put everything into the right syntax and put the commas and colons everywhere that they need to be without any issues or any, and if you do have an error with it, you will get an error message. So if I forget this bracket here and we test this, it's going to tell us the block element was not closed on line 10. Great, we'll close it, and now we'll execute this again, and it runs just fine. But in this case, if I do this again and change this to a comma, we just see that it's broken. And if this is a very large array or very large object, we'd have to go in and try and figure out manually what has caused that. Does that explain it?
That makes total sense. Thank you.
Okay, my pleasure. Okay, so now that we have all this data doesn't really make a difference, I guess. Now, what we need to do is initialize the game. So we need to bring in the randomized values into the card IDs. Because if they're all 0, then of course they're all going to match, and that's not a very fun game. So we'll make a new macro that's going to be called memory, and again, I'm going to start, I'm going to be creating these macros, remembering that we'll likely be adding more games to this widget in the future. So organization is going to be useful here, and will help us in the future for again, future games. Reset game. And we'll use a path here, memory, and apply. So the path on this side of, beside the name of this, when you have a widget that's full of a lot of functions and macros, you can see where this would be useful, because you can have folders, and even inside of this, we can have subfolders. So we can put that inside of yet another subfolder. So that will help organize this widget and a lot of other widgets in the future as well. So we want to reset this game. So we know we have 15 cards. I'm just going to open my notes here. And we have, so we have 15 cards. So let's say the variable cards equals, and there's a few ways we can do this. We can say the array resize, and we can say cards. So we want to tell the widget that this array is 15. 15 members large. So now we can say debug message, and we use the member that Nina told us about yesterday, and say count, and we'll test this one. I just push Control T. So we have 15 locations in this array. Now we want to set all of the cards. So we remember when we were flipping the cards over, these will be, what we will be doing is changing these from 0 to 1 to tell us that the card is flipped over. So we can't flip them over again. So we'll need to set that back to 0. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. So what we're going to do is we'll assign some random numbers to this array. So we'll get rid of this debug message. The array and random, so RND, oh, sorry, vset. Vset array random, unique integer. So we want to start with the array name, so cards. And our start value is going to be 1 because our first card is 1. And our end value is 15 because we have 15 cards. So now we can go debug message and then cards. And we'll see that there's our randomized values. So I'll create a button here that will, actually we'll be running it into this script, but for now, just for demonstration, memory reset game, we'll apply this. And if we continue to push this button, we see we have completely random values every time. But the problem with this is we obviously don't want our cards from 1 to 15 because then we won't have any matches. So in this case, we want to be putting our cards from 1 to 7. We have an odd one out. So in this case, in this game, when I created this, the 16:9 kind of aspect ratio and the amount of icons that I had in my back pocket, I created 8 icons. So we do have a logo icon as well. So when this one gets flipped over, you get to see a nice Christie logo on the other side of the card, and that one doesn't have a match. And it's just the way it is. It's the luck of the draw, as it were. So we want to create matches for these cards. So we're going to be using some math, and the nice thing about Widget is we can use math in line here. So let's Just going to comment these so we can remember what they are. So we can see what the randomized cards are here. We'll leave that comment there. And create matches for cards. So in this, we're going to create our loop where I equals 0 to cards.count, again from Janina's lesson yesterday. And debug message, we can see if we put I in here, we can see as this counts up, we'll get 14 output. We'll actually get 15 numbers because we include 0, because our first position is 4. So I can call each location in this array, in this list, by typing in the variable. Sorry, make this bigger. Typing in the variable and its index in square brackets. So we test this again. Now we see it calls up each location one at a time. So from here, we will be using the function. It's definitely not unique to Widget Designer. A function called modulo. So a modulo, it's basically it divides our numbers by itself. Or so when you have a modulo, let's say we have, in this case, we have our cards. So mod, and we're going to say cards. So we'll use the same value as before. Cards at the index of I. So again, from 0 to 14. We want to make them integers and not an object, because again, we don't know what's in this list. So we have to tell Widget Designer that they're integers. And our modulo of 8. So when we go from 1 through 7, we'll stay as 1 through 7. And then once we get to 8, we start back at 0 again. So if we pull this again and we say debug, we'll come out of here, debug message cards. And we have to assign this back to the card as well. And we'll say our cards I. So we're going to assign the value back into this list, and we'll say test. We can see 4, and then when we get to 8, it's 0, and then 2 more, and then 6 is the same, and so on. So now we have our matches. So we have 4 and 4, 5 and 5, and so on. So we've created our matches now. And again, if we run this again, we've got completely new matches, completely randomized. But in our Pandora's box project, we actually don't have a location 0. You can't assign 0 to a layer. So what this is, and what this will be, if we look in here, all of these numbers match with, we're not matching layers, we're actually matching with the objects themselves, sorry, the media files themselves. So 1, 1, 1, 2. So in this case, we would be putting number 4 on layer 1 and on 2 and on layer 11 or 12. And that's where our match would end up. So that's why we're doing this logic here. But we don't have a media 0. So what we'll do, so again, I'm going to right click on this, on the variable that's inside of here, and go to definition, which will open my macro back up. And we're going to make an if statement. If modulo equals 0, then modulo equals 8. We'll make this a little bit more organized here. You can put this all in one line in this case, because there's only one action happening inside of this if statement. So now we can see where it would have been 0, 8 here, Now we've assigned it back to 8. So this is the 15th. So this this tile here, the very last tile, would be the one. This one here would be the one that has the Christie logo on it and no match that goes along with it. Now we want to set this this list into our JSON file, or our JSON variable. So we want to set it to here. So card IDs, we want this to match those numbers so we can store this data so we can call it back later when the game is being played. So now we can say game JSON set, and we can actually just follow along here. So we can see game, in quotes, game data dot memory dot, and we'll scroll down here, card IDs. And again, remember that the case is very important here. And we'll put a quote there. And now we'll say cards. And we'll debug this as we see game data to pretty string. Okay, sorry, game JSON. And we'll test this. And we can see now that those cards, they were created up here. And they're moduloed, the math is done, and now they're stored inside of our variable in the widget designer. So we can pull this up anytime we need. So if somebody flips a card, we can, it's card 1, we can call up that card. So I'm also going to say text box 1 text equals game JSON to pretty string. And there we go. We have that stored in here, so we can see it. And I'll get rid of this debug message so it doesn't keep popping up on us. Now we need to assign those to Pandora's box. So we need to tell the layers to be those numbers. So we can actually do that right inside of the same for loop if we'd like, which would be the easiest way. So we don't have, so it's the most efficient way to run it. So when we create a position 1, or we randomize it and we make the pairs for position 1, position 2, position 3, and so on, index 1, 2, 3 in the list, we can also just directly assign it to Pandora's box. So what I'll do in Pandora's box so we can see it happening is I'll just flip all these layers over 180, so we can see they're all Christie right now. And we'll be using, because we are connected to between Pandora's box and the widget designer, that's something I didn't actually go over. I'll do that really quickly. So if we have the widget designer open, we have the picking mode for this. We did create this node. What we skipped over, we also need to add a widget device into the Pandora's box project and put in the IP address of the widget designer as well. That way the information gets passed to and from the widget to Pandora's box and vice versa. So that should go fine. So now we have our PB connection as well. So my local IP is being used. So we are connected from our widget designer to Pandora's box. So that's all fine. And we'll open up this macro again, reset game. So we can say device, all right, make this bigger. Device set media. And we are setting Pandora's box 2, sorry, the device 2, site ID 2, and then I. But remember, we start at 0 for this count, so we need to say I plus 1. So again, we can do the inline math just fine, comma. Our folder ID, we can see down here, is folder 1. And the actual file ID will be the same as it'll be the modulo. Put that back in brackets again, and we'll run this test again, and I'll get rid of that pop-up there so we can see it. And now we can see very quickly in really, like if we get rid of all of our commented things here, in just a few lines, we're creating, we're randomizing our game. So that's how we can set it up. And we don't have to have a huge cache of preset objects or preset layouts. We can, of course, have preset layouts if we'd like, but we can have a truly randomized setup for these cards. So that's done. And what we also want to do is when we reset this is flip all the cards back over to 0. So it's our Y angle that we want to be resetting to 0. And we probably, well, in this case, we'll do this at the bottom for I equals 1 to 14, because we're working with layer 1 to 14. And what we should note as well, this I am declaring for this variable, we can use again, because when we create a variable in here, inside of a for loop or inside of a switch or an if statement, when it's first called, it's created here. And then as soon as this for loop is over, this modulo variable doesn't exist anymore. It's taken out of the memory and the memory is freed back up. So if we try and after that for loop and debug message modulo, it doesn't pop up. And we try and test this again. It says it'll be processed as a literal because it doesn't see, and as a literal means that if we were to put something in quotation marks, that's a literal. If it's not in quotation marks, it tries to see if it's a variable first. If it's not a variable, then it just interpolates it as a literal. So we can see that we are getting an error because that variable doesn't exist. If we put that back inside of that for loop, the exact same message, and test it again, it does exist in there. So for the same reason, I can use I again. I could even use modulo again in this bottom for loop if we wanted to. We won't. We don't need to. But it can be recycled. So now we're just going to really just flip these layers back to 0. So device fade to parameter. Our site is 2. Our device is I, Y angle, and then the value we want to go to is 0. And just added a bit of a fade time, so we'll do a ½ second fade time, and we'll close this. So now we can see if we test this, it'll reset them all, and oh, we're missing the last one because I have 14. We actually have 15 layers. And it activates them all at the same time. Now, if we wanted to get creative, and we can actually add a wait queue, WD wait, and let's do another ½ second, and we'll actually cascade. You can see it resets all the things here. Now I have created this before and have different modes on it for when kids are playing. You actually switch all the cards, let them see it for about a second or two, and then flip them all over and see if the little kids can remember and play along that way. Okay. So now we have this done, and we have our variables in here. We have our card IDs stored. And Janina, are there any questions at the moment?
No, that script is clear. Thanks.
Okay, great. Okay. Now we will be adding another macro for when we click the buttons, for when we actually click the on the cards. So we'll be creating a memory flip. And again, we'll put this into a memory folder. So from here, this is where it gets really fun. Now, one thing we're going to do is we're going to say we need to start recalling some of these variables into this script, so we can play with these variables in the script and then write them back again. So one of the first things we'll do is we need to call the score. Variable score equals game JSON dot get integer game data memory score. And again, we'll debug this and we'll say score. We don't need the quotation marks because again, it's not a literal. We are recalling a variable and it's 0. As we can see, that is correct. It's 0. That's great. And I'm not going to test all of these. So we want to say also card. Now this is going to be the card number that's flipped over when this is run. So this will be activated, this will be run when someone clicks on this card. So we want the card to equal selected layer. So that's fine. And we'll say -1, because this is what we're going to be using to interact with all of our indexes in our JSON file, in our JSON variable. So what we're going to do now is link this memory flip with this button click. So remember before, when we first started, we went into script output and we created this node for when every time this is clicked, it's going to activate anything that's in this true script. So because we again, we're going to have many different games in this version of Widget Designer, we're going to create a variable, or a macro that's a little bit more dynamic than just directly accessing the memory flip macro. So what we'll do is we'll make a switch. This is where we said we'd be using this switch, and we want to get the game mode from here. So layer interaction, and then we'll hit apply so it exists. Layer interaction, and that's all we need for that script output. Switch, and then we'll say game JSON get string, and we will say it is game mode, and that's it. Now we can tell it case memory and tell it to do memory. Oh, sorry, we need an opening curly bracket. I knew that was missing because the autocomplete didn't pop up there. So now we can do memory flip and close the curly bracket again. And we can also say case, whatever other games we're creating, and we'd say snake go. Let's see. Okay. So in this case, memory flip. So when we click this button, we will be activating memory flip. You can see the score is 0. So if we actually do debug message and we say memory score, you can see it pop up here. So now we know if we go verbose. So in the debugger, we do have a verbose mode where we can see the path that things take to actually activate a variable, or sorry, a macro. So we see when we click this, our layer interaction script is calling, our window 1, page 1, node 3. That is window 1, page 1, node 3. is calling layer interaction. The layer interaction is doing its logic and calling memory flip, which then activates that macro. And in that macro, we can see we have memory score as our debug message on line 7 is memory score. So that's the output of that of the memory flip function or macro. So it's very handy if you start seeing errors or don't know how something is being called. If you hit verbose, it can bring up a lot of information, but if you hit verbose, then you can actually see where that's coming from and why. So we'll go back into our memory flip function or macro. And we have our card number. And we also want to know how many cards have been flipped already. So I'm just going to use this and say flipped. So we can see how many cards have been flipped, so we can do our logic from there. Just keep these together. So if we click on one of these layers, what we can do is device fade to parameter. So we can say site2 ID would be selected. Actually, we're also going to say variable local selected layer. So the reason we're going to do this equals selected layer. When we execute this macro, what we'll be doing is capturing what this variable is. So we don't want accidentally, if we have a delay somewhere in this variable, let's say you click on one of these buttons, you want it to wait half a second before it flips over, but when you've clicked on it, in that half second, someone's moved the cursor to another button or someone's touched another button, then that running macro will pull from the live selected layer variable that would have changed. So if we declare this variable local selected layer in the very top, in the very beginning, it's going to take that and basically make it a constant. So it will tell this variable at this moment, whatever this selected layer is, so as soon as the person clicks the button or the tile, this will be captured. And it doesn't matter if this changes afterwards. We can wait 10 minutes before we execute this script. It will store that selected layer into the local variable. It's something it's a fun thing to try and figure out why the wrong card keeps getting flipped over, especially when you're using a device like an AirScan. So we're going to tell it that device to flip over will be local selected layer. And the parameter that we want to control is the Y angle. And we want 180 degrees. And we're going to do let's say 0.2 seconds. Excuse me, 0.2 seconds. So now we'll apply that. And if we click on it, we see that the cards are being flipped over and the correct ones are being flipped over. But of course, there's no other logic than other than just flipping them over. So we can also make this, I believe we can make this, so plus or minus 180. And if we reset our memory again, we can see that'll flip them all back over for us. We'll speed that up just a little bit right now, just so we don't have to wait there. Okay, so we have them flipping and we have them resetting. That's fine. Next, we want to know what card is being flipped over when the button is clicked. So when let's call that up. So we say variable flipped ID equals, and we'll say game JSON get integer game data dot memory dot what did we call that? We called it card IDs. And then the index of the card that's flipped over, which we have already declared here. So we can just use that simply as card. And when we do this, we need to add, because if I type in card inside the quotations, it's again a literal. So we'll actually just try and pull up the card index, but of course an index has to be an integer, so it won't work. So if I do it as card, as card IDs plus with a period, and then card in there again, and if I say debug message, and we say flipped ID, okay, great, and we flip this over. I'll turn off verbose. We can see our ID is here. So our flipped ID keeps showing up there. So if we actually find a match, there we go. So this one and this one are matches. So we see flipped ID 5, and the first one we flipped over is flipped ID 5. So we do have a match there. Now, because these variables, the flipped ID, it's executed immediately, and then once it's executed and this macro finishes, it's deleted. So we also need to store this flipped ID into our global variable, again, which is our flipped IDs here. So we can remember that which card we have flipped over to know if it's a match or not. So if we say, we also need to know which place to store it in, just to know if it's at 0 or at 1. So if it's our first card that we flipped over or the second card we flipped over. So the first thing we'll do is we'll look at our flipped variable. And we know, because no cards have been flipped over, because no cards have been flipped over, we know that it's right now we know it's 0. So we know that, but the program doesn't know that. So we need to say game JSON dot set, and then we'll say flipped ID dot, and then we'll add flipped. So right now because it's 0, that makes sense. And
short break, it's flipped IDs.
Thank you. Any other questions over here?
None that I haven't answered yet.
Okay, perfect. And instead of debugging all the time, what we'll do is we'll actually one, because it's there for a reason, text equals JSON dot supply, and we'll stay here. Did that not work? Oh, of course. So flipped, comma, and we need to say card. No, we need to find out which card ID it is. So flipped ID, and that's what we'll be storing into this file. So we can see 8 has been flipped over, 7 has been flipped over. So now what we need to do is add to our flipped status. So what we can do is go in and say flipped at the end of this, flipped plus equals 1. And now we can store this into, oh, we actually don't even need flip plus equals 1. We can just say this one. We're going to organize this in just a moment as well. So this starts making a lot more sense. Set game data, memory, flipped, comma, 1. So now when we click this, our first one's going to be 6. Now we've just set that to 1. And our second one's going to be 3. Well, there's no match, and now we need to reset everything back to 0. So now we have our logic to get our match. Now we need to know what to do if a card's been flipped over already. So now if we keep looking at our flipped ID, it still shows 1, and it's only showing 1, and we need to flip them back over. So we've also missed one variable here. I'm going to add it manually, and I promise this will make sense in just a moment. Flipped layers. So what I've just done here, we need to know which layer has been flipped so we can flip them back over. So we can see I've just added this manually instead of going back through the whole chain of events there. So we need to be able to remember which layer has been touched so we can flip that layer back over if it doesn't match. So, and as well, we also only want these to flip over if they're not already flipped over. So we also need to store, remember this flip state here? We need to start using this flip state. So we'll say variable flipped state equals, and we'll kind of call this again game JSON get integer. We'll say game data memory and flipped state period plus card. And now we'll have the flip state of that card. So that's all of our variables that we have that we've declared at the top here. So I usually like to, if they're going to be variables that we use throughout the whole script, I like to put them at the top and also to group them together. So now we'll start organizing this and make things happen only when we want them to happen. So we're going to say if flipped state equals 0, then we flip the card over. Right? If it equals 1, then we know it's already flipped. Okay. And we want to say, so if flip state equals 0, that's fine. And we also want to set our flipped, sorry, we say game JSON dot set game data dot memory flipped state period plus card. So what we're doing now is we're going to set the flip state of the card that we just flipped over to 1. So now if we click on card 1, of course it's already flipped, so flip state to 0. Let's see what's happening here. Okay, there's card. So card 2 is just flipped over. Card 3 was just flipped over. So we can see that it is recognizing whether or not a card has been flipped over or not. And if we say, if we want to look at this script, if it's running or not, debug message, new flip. So now we can, again, look at our debugger. And That's a new flip. But if we click it again, it won't run again because we have set our object saying this is flipped. It is 1. Okay, we'll reset that. It is flipped. It's set to 1, so we can't flip it over again. So it's a new flip, and now I can click on that as many times as I want. Every time I click that, it's recalling this location in here to check its state. So it won't flip it over again. So what do we do now? Okay, so if it is flipped, we also want to set, we've set this to 1. And we have also set our flipped ID. So we know what our flipped ID is. Also, we're going to store the flipped layer right now as well in this same place. Yeah, I'll just copy and paste this line. We'll edit it a little bit so there's less typing. And local selected layer. No. Local selected layer, and this is going to be if flipped state equals 0. We're actually just going to tell it directly in here. We don't need a variable for this to store it in 0 because we know no other cards have been flipped over in this pairing match because it's 0. And it's a new flip. We can get rid of this. So now we can say if flipped state equals 1. Now we'll do the same thing again. Copy this and paste this. And we'll be putting the flipped ID into location 1 instead of location 0. And the game JSON selected layer, that is going to be 1 as well. So we know which layer has been flipped. So we need to close this if statement. And we need to reset all of these layers again. And I did reference this earlier. What we need to do as well in this case is when we do reset all of these cards to flip back over, we also need to reset the JSON objects back to 0. So this doesn't do us much good if everything is flipped back over, but these are still at 1 and all of these values, nothing can happen because they're all still at 1 and so on. So if we, hold on, we have an error here, 1721. Block element was not closed. Oh, I didn't hit apply. There we go. So that one will flip over because it wasn't before. Where are we here? No. We don't want this one. Sorry, this is, we need to nest an if statement here. If flipped, so this is the number of cards that are flipped, equals 0, then do this. And if we highlight all of these and hit tab, it tabs them all. If we hit shift tab, it untabs them. I'll come to the end. And we'll say we need these ones to be inside of here as well. So if flipped equals 0, so we can say if flipped equals 1, and it'll only ever equal 2 different values, so that's fine. Let's flip flipped ID. And we need to put this inside of here as well. So we're changing the flipped state to 1. And in here, we'll switch it back. We'll do some other logic in here in a moment. So now we can see nothing's flipping over, not because we have errors, but because they're already all, their flip state is already all at 1. So the very last card should be able to flip over because it was at 0. The third last card can, second last cannot because the widget thinks it's already flipped over. because we haven't reset it. So if we come in here and we now have to say, yeah, we can paste that. And we can say cards at the very top. Before we assign any values here, we're gonna borrow this variable here. We're gonna say flipped state. Because as we remember, this cards is 15 empty, 15 zeros in a row. So we're going to borrow that before we randomize the number, and we'll just set all of these variables back to 0. So no, we're not. I guess we can't borrow that. That's fine. 15 of them. And here we go. So again, there are ways to do this. Right now, for the sake of expediency, we'll just do that. So now when we reset the game, we see they're all flipped back to 0. And we also want to tell flipped to go back to 0 as well. So we're going to say, we'll comment this, reset JSON variable in JSON.set, and we'll copy this again. Flipped 0. There we go. And probably we will get to it, and we might as well do this now. We'll reset the score to 0-2. Just because we're in this state. Now these ones don't really matter, but we'll reset these back as well. Flipped IDs. IDs, and we'll put -1, -1. And that will make sense for our logic in a moment. Because we don't want, if we have them both at 0, then if we're at -1, then we'll know that we're at -1, and we're not going to compare anything that's below 0. And I'll explain that right now. So here we have our logic here again to flip cards over. And we know that we have our flipped cards here. So let's get a variable going here, and let's say card A equals, and then we'll get an integer here. We're going to copy because we're getting this. We've just stored everything into our JSON variable. So I'm going to get flipped ID. Flipped IDs rather, and we'll say 0, quotation mark at the end, and we will get B as well, card B. So here's our next nested if statement. If card A equals card B, and we'll just do this for now. Card A equals card B. Now we can say debug message match. And we'll close that if statement there. We'll have this if statement as well. And now we can flip a card over. And we can kind of cheat here a little bit. So that was card 1, 2, that was 4, and then the other 4 is the last one. No, it's not. There we go, match. So we can see that we have a match. So if it matches, we see match, and then if it doesn't, if it doesn't match, then we will say we need to set these debug message no match, and we will reset flipped back to 0. Actually, we need to reset flip back to 0 anyways. So we'll do that outside of this nested if statement, actually. That makes sense. No match. So there's card 1, card 2, card 1, card 2. So now we need to reset. So if we say 3, the second card, and the last card, we see a match. If we do any other 2 cards, 7, this one and this one, no match. And we have to see why that first one isn't flipping over. Memory flip. So I think we have done something backwards here. Oh, flip state +1 selected layer. Okay, flip layers is what we want here. I didn't change flip layers. This is why that's happening. Now we can get, so here we go. Flip layers, now we can say I flip layer 1 and 2. So if it doesn't match, we want to flip these 2 layers back. So we can recycle this script. So Control-C, Control-V. So local selected layer, we want to change that out. We can just do this all online. It'll be a bit long, but it'll work. So we can say game JSON get integer game data dot memory dot flipped layers dot 1, and we'll do that again. Control-C, Control-V, and 0 and 1, and we want to set them back to 0 from 180 degrees. At the same time, we want to set the state of these cards back to 0. So flipped IDs, we also want to say, no, we also need to store the flipped integers as well, so we know which position or which index here. So again, I'm going to insert something into here also. Forgive me here. The reason we need this is to know which 2 of these to set back to 0. So we also need to say card usually I have a whole flow chart of how to do this, and I'm not doing this on the fly like this. Which is why I'm missing these little parts here. Flipped in integer dot 0 equals card, and we'll do that down here again, so we know which card to flip over, to flip back rather. So if we do this again, close to block of the wrong type. I've likely missed a quotation mark. 3110. Oh, else. Here we go. This is where the debugger comes in very handy, so we can find where we've made any issues, any errors. Janina, do you see it?
Yeah, I'm also searching. There's definitely one bracket too much in that else statement, because I think
Yes.
that is that. The problem with this debug message is that it can literally be anywhere. This is just where it detects that something goes wrong.
Of course. That one, that's that one, and this one and this one match. This one and this one match. No, that's the first one. Going too fast here. Murphy's Law, right?
Oh, I see it. Okay. In the device fade to param commands in the else statements, there needs to be two additional brackets in the end.
Thank you. Yes, because we have, not at the very end, it has to be right here. Thank you. An unknown property with integer. (16)2. Did I misspell this? Layers. Didn't save that properly, I guess.
Where do you set the flipped integers?
I didn't. Add it to the very end. And this is so we know which place. So we can, here we go, flipped integers. Flipped integer 4, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and flipped integer 5. And we'll close this. Okay. So we can see that these have flipped back over, but we don't know where the widget doesn't know that they've flipped back over. Right, so now we need to tell these to go back to 0 as well after they've flipped back over. We'll open our flipped macro again, and we're just about there. So we can say game JSON dot set game data dot memory dot flip states. And we need to get the location here. So we need to add, again, we'll do this in line. We need to get integer. Now remember, we could do this as local variables here, but that would only work for the second card that's been flipped over, not the first card. So we'll recall the stored data. Game data mem memory and flipped integer dot 0 and a quotation mark, comma, and we'll set that back to 0. And we'll do the same thing for the second location. It looks complicated, but really is, it's almost not. So here's 1, no match, so I set it back to 0. Here we go again, no match. Now we don't get to see the second one flipped over, so what we can do before we actually reset everything is put a wait command, wd wait 1. Now we actually get to see the second card that doesn't match. So flip the first one, flip the second one, no match, and they go back to 0. No match, and of course I'm going to forget where these all are, so I know the globe is the first one. Once I see the globe again, didn't even see the second globe. There we go. Okay, and it's a match. Now they stay flipped over because it is a match. And what we need to do now is reset our flipped integer back to 0, which is already done because it's outside of these both of these if statements. And why don't we set our score score plus equals 1. And we can store that into our JSON variable as well. Game JSON.set, and we can do this whole thing again, but I'm going to come up here to the very top line, and I'm going to copy and paste this. Control V, and score with our score variable, score. Perfect. Now, if we'd like to see our score, we can come down here, and I'm going to change this memory score. Change our label title to memory score. Change that to this, and we can, at the very bottom of this, now we can also say memory score. That's the, actually what I'm going to do as well, just so I know it's a label, LBL. So just so we know it's a label, because we can have a lot of these things. If we have things that aren't labeled, label 1, label 2, label 3, and we actually do a memory score label, it's easier to find later on. You don't have to go and search for it on another page if you're on a different page. But if you put LBL or something like that, or if it's a drop-down menu and you relabel it, I always like to put underscore or DD at the end, so I know it's a drop-down menu. So I want the text to equal score. So now our score equals 1. It won't show up now, so if I click these again, we play, oops. So this is some of our logic we need to write in as well, is that once the 2 are flipped over, we can't flip any more over. So we see we have our score of 1. So let's go in, we just saw I quickly clicked the buttons and it didn't work. Okay, flipped state equals 0. Okay, that's fine. We will get to that part, that's fine. So it does match. So we want to set the score to 1, and we want to keep combining. And this is pretty much almost all the logic of this game. We can also, if it does match, we can also change some of the variables, but it doesn't. So let's go down here and see what happens if we run the whole game. So 1 and 1, 5 and 5, 7 and 7. At some point, I'm going to have to actually play the game. 7 and which one was that? 7 and okay. Well, that's good. Let's see, we didn't match, so it flipped back. It resets. That doesn't match either. It reset again. Okay. Cat and cat. And here we go. So now we've won the game. So what happens if we win the game? So if we would like, we can do some pretty thing if we'd like. So we can see at the very top, our score is 7. Our flip state is 0 again. But if we click on these again, nothing's going to happen because they're all already flipped, as we can see. So we can click on this guy, but it flips over. It doesn't have a match. But now nothing else will flip either. So we can use our score. We can watch our score every time these buttons are clicked. We can actually test and run other logic on whatever data we have. So if we say at the very bottom, once we've set the score, so we say score plus 1. Every time we make a match, the score goes up 1. So now we can say if score equals 7. We can make a debug message that says winner winner, chicken dinner, or we can just say let's flip all of the cards over 2 times, let's say. So we can grab our device flip here, our angle, and let's say 180 degrees plus 360, 180 plus 360, 540, just for fun. And let's do a for loop for I equals 1 to 15, because there are 15 layers. And instead of local selected layer, we will use I and WD weights. And let's say 0.1, so it's nice and quick. And then that'll stop. So we want the for loop to stop, and then let's WD wait 1 second, and we can say memory _ reset game. So now we have a game. I can just run this as a test now because we are at 7. So everything here is not going to do anything because one of the layers will be selected, but nothing will happen. So at the very end, we'll do test, and now we can see it just never being 1, and now it resets to a new game. So now we have, again, we can do 3, 3, 2. Now, in other setups, I have created like a matrix using a list view and just assign these to all the cells. So you can have a cheat sheet. It's really useful for kind of doing some quick demos if we need to. And 6, 1, 2. Oh, well, here we are playing a memory game. What's that? 7 and 7. No, of course. Now, if we want to make that a little bit more smooth for the resets, we can move the fade back to the rotation before we actually reset the tiles that are on these. So now these will reset, and we can say WD weights, and we can do the pretty thing again, 0.2, wait 0.2 seconds. And we can play the game again. And I think this kind of illustrates that pretty simply. Are there any questions?
No.
Okay. Everyone wants to watch me play this a bunch of times. I think this kind of concludes everything here. There are some caveats here. I did click something too quickly. So if we do click before that expires, then it will then that will happen. But yeah, there are ways to fix that. I don't and we can change this. We can go a little bit deeper into timing and just perfect all the timings, but that's a little bit of trial and error there if you'd like to try that. And 2, and then we'll wait WG, wait 1 second or half a second, and the cards will randomize. And there you have it. So now we have in about an hour and a half, we have our first widget game. I'll put some of the files on online. These tiles. Unless you have a friend like I do who knows Blender, who knows Blender pretty well, it can be frustrating to make a 3D object that's flat, that has 2 sides, and that can be centered like this with these things. It's one of my colleagues, Brian, actually, who's great with those kind of applications, and came and saved the day for that. Thanks, Brian. So yeah, if there's no more questions, I think we'll leave everything open, and if anyone does come up with any questions within 5 minutes or so, we'll be happy to answer. Otherwise, this will be on YouTube shortly. And yeah, happy widgeting.